The CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. The presentation was delivered with slides. To view those slides, or to learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples.
Hi everybody, welcome to our latest wonderful event in the Culture and Creativity Seminar Series for the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research at the University of Canberra. I'm Tracy Ireland. It's lovely to welcome you all here today and to acknowledge that we're meeting on Ngunnawal country. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here. So it's my great pleasure today to welcome Julian Knowles to give, I think, what must be his first seminar here at the University of Canberra. Julian is a very well-known composer, performer and researcher working with new and emerging technologies. So Julian's research-driven music and audiovisual works have been presented at many prestigious and high-profile events and venues around the world, such as the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Audiosphere, Musée Reina Sofia, Madrid, Experimental Intermedia at What is Music, Australian Perspecta, Liquid Architecture, the Melbourne International Film Festival, Vivid Sydney, and the Sydney Opera House. And Julian, of course, is Executive Dean in the Faculty of Arts and Design here at the University. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Julian to talk to us today.
Thanks, everyone. This is going to be a classic time for Executive Dean presentation with a whole bunch of gear that may or may not work. So it's great to be here today to sort of give you, to switch gears into researcher mode, to just talk about a recent work of mine called Solar Halo, and to give you a little bit of an insight into, I guess, my research interests and my research activity, in this case, particularly in practice-led research through practice. And we will get a little bit of an insight there into how that work is conceived and worked. So basically, this is my most recent work, and it was presented. It was premiered in New York in December last year at a venue called Harvest Works on Broadway, which is a digital media presentation organization. So just a little bit about my background. So I must be getting old now. I've been spending about 30 years in the field of music, audio, art, digital and experimental media. So my original disciplinary background was in music, but my interests were very deeply inside technology. And when you get your head inside technology from any discipline, you encounter many other disciplines. And that's just the way that it works, because once you start working with sound, you start in computers, you start working with video, graphics. So those of you in the room who work with computers and technology will know exactly what I'm talking about. So, I've made films, I've done video installations, I've played in bands, I've done electronic music for a really long time, but it all has a kind of a coherence to it in terms of this idea that I'm interested in the creative potentials of new technologies and the way in which those technologies can create kind of paradigmatic shifts in the way in which we think about art in relation to society, but also in relation to what constitutes the creative process more broadly. So I'm actually really interested in research into the practice. But also I like to use practice to investigate other things outside of practice. So in terms of those modalities of research, I have an interest in kind of positioning practice in both kinds of ways. So in recent years, as you'll see today, I've had an interest in the kind of data sphere, or the way in which we are surrounded by live data all the time, and thinking about the ways in which we can make use of this kind of data sphere that we're in the creative process. And in particular, in this work, it's really looking at the kind of more unusual context for live data, and that is in performance. You see it used in all kinds of other contexts, in installation works and so on, and I've been there, done a bit of that work. But in this particular piece, I wanted to think about how a performer could be in a space and be engaging with live data as a performance agent, if you like. So I was connecting that idea with another recent work. So I think most of us have been kind of aware, because how could we not be aware of some of the extreme climate events that have been occurring in recent years? And so the one that really struck me was the bushfire events of 2020. And around that time, I was invited to create a work for a international show in Spain at Museo Reina Sofia. It was called Audiosphere, and it was basically an international survey of audio art. And I created a work called The Billion, which was kind of like a tribute to the billion creatures that were wiped off the face of of Australia during that bushfire event. And it was almost a number that was inconceivably large, and that got me thinking about this whole problem of the way in which we grasp concepts as large as a billion creatures being wiped out through an extreme climate event. It's something that tends to want to escape cognition, and that's kind of an interesting problem to try and engage with. So there's a philosopher called Timothy Morton who has a name for these things. He calls them hyperobjects, and they're entities of such vast temporal and spatial dimensions that they defeat traditional ideas about what a thing is in the first place. And he says, hyperobjects are here, right here in my social and experiential space. Like faces pressed against a window, they leer at me menacingly. Their very nearness is what menaces. From the center of the galaxy, a supermassive black hole impinges on my awareness, as if it were sitting in the car next to me at the traffic lights. Every day, global warming burns the skin on the back of my neck, making me itch with physical discomfort and inner anxiety. Evolution unfolds in my genome as my cells divide. So, Timothy Morton is kind of trying to, I guess, give a name to these sort of large concepts that we know are there and are always present with us, but they are so vast and so large that they tend to escape comprehension. So, that's sort of this, I was sort of inspired by this idea of, in a way, of how can art, how can creative modes of communication assist us in trying to come closer to comprehending some of these vast and epically proportioned events or things. So that's kind of one of the sort of driving inquiries underneath this kind of work. So I had done quite a lot of work in what you might call environmental art or environmental audio. Some time ago, in the 1990s, I was involved with a collaborative group called Social Interiors, and we released a number of CDs on the Extreme Records label, which were entirely made of field recordings. So we would spend a lot of time together recording in the bush, in the natural environment, well, the time in kind of pretty uncomfortable locations at ridiculous hours of the evening or night, getting leeches all over us or whatever we did. But essentially, we spent a lot of time with nature in the environment, listening to it. And when you do this kind of work, you try and listen to nature in a different way. There's a French theorist, Michel Chion, whose work rests upon earlier people like Pierre Schaeffer, who have developed theories of listening. And it's a way of being able to listen in a less representational, less semantic way. So there are concepts like a reduced listening, where you just listen to the shapes of sounds. You maybe listen to an insect texture, but in a sense, you can let your imagination run and it becomes a kind of an orchestra. I used to do a really interesting trick with my students when I was teaching sound, where we would do a music class where I would play them a recording of what seemed to be really interesting and kind of obscure electronic synthesizers, maybe from a 1960s work or something, and I would get them to listen to this piece, and we would listen to it and discuss its structure and what was going on in this piece. And, we would get 15 minutes into that conversation, and then I would reveal to them that what they had been listening to was the sound of Weddell seals under the ice in Antarctica. And so in a way, it's kind of that shift in the way that we think and that we listen is really important. But it also gets you thinking about context being really important in work, and the way in which we can think about our environment in relation to an artwork. And there was some pretty important works in the kind of mid-1950s along these lines. So perhaps one of the more famous ones was Robert Rauschenberg's white painting from 1951. It's in totally white painting. The idea of the work being that, I think he described it as a container for light and dust. And so, in a sense, what this kind of work was doing was reflecting back to you that the gallery itself was a thing, and that the light and the dust and everything that was in the gallery was in fact part of the artwork. So you kind of get to this sense where you kind of understand what is the relationship of the artwork to the space around it, what is the relationship of the viewer to the artwork. It gets you thinking along those lines. White painting was pretty important work in terms of trying to flip the lens on what an artwork is and flip the lens around, how an artwork exists in relation to those things around it. 1 year later, John Cage, not coincidentally, probably because he was aware of Rauschenberg's work, composed a piece of music called 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which was a silent work, and it was performed. I think it was first performed by the pianist David Tudor, and in the work, the pianist comes out on stage, lifts the lid on the piano, and plays nothing. And people shuffle in their seats and cough, and you can hear the traffic from the outside or the something on the roof or whatever. And again, once again, it kind of, in a sonic way, in a musical way, it draws attention to, to that kind of flip that Rauschenberg was doing, the white paintings. So these are kind of important works to make us think about the way in which an artwork relates to its environment. If we think about it in broader terms and we zoom out, we're thinking about context responsive art. Okay, and in the 1950s and so on, that context responsive art was often responding to physical spaces, galleries. But in kind of the current environment, our context is also electronic. And so we constantly have data kind of circulating around us at all times through all the Wi-Fi that's in this room and the networks. So basically, if you think about context in a 2024 kind of way, you have to be thinking about the data sphere at the same time as you're thinking about the kind of physical world around us. So that makes us think about, well, okay, how do we think about data as a context in which we might be able to make work? There are various, I guess, ways in which data is turned into things that are what might think as sort of visual artifacts or auditory artifacts, and most of you will be aware of data visualization, for example, or data sonification, which is kind of the representation of large data sets in audio or visual forms, often for functional reasons, to be able to understand something better, to be able to perceive patterns. There's a whole kind of context or reasons why you might visualize or sonify data. But off the end of that kind of work, there's been a movement to see data as artistic material. And so from that emerges the idea of data art, which then gets you thinking about, can data have affective properties in itself, which is kind of an interesting thing to ponder. And maybe you're seeing where I'm going with this in terms of, Timothy Morton's idea of the hyperobject and these, massive things that are beyond cognition, and the possibilities that might lie here, therefore, to approach it from an affective and data point of view, to kind of get these large data sets or these complex data sets and create some kind of affective experience, which kind of speaks to us in a way that 2 degrees of warming might not. So it's kind of an interesting way to start thinking. And there's an emerging field of which people are calling climate aesthetics, which exists, and it's kind of circulating around this whole idea of the affective properties of, I guess, the climate crisis or climate change or whatever, and people working in that space of thinking about, what's the aesthetic realm of this. So there's sort of these sort of intersecting ideas that kind of hook up and they relate to each other from the point of view of like, back to the hyperobject. How can we kind of get people better connected to these vast systems? So if you want to drill it down to a series of kind of research aims, so the first is to address the research gap around the possibilities of real-time data as an agent in live performance, as distinct from installation contexts and other ways in which it has been used. And in a musical context, little is known about the various ways in which live data can be used in performance, and the way that to conceptualize the idea of live data as a performance agent or a co-agent in a performance context. How can it coexist with humans in that sort of context? I think last week Richard Savory was around and did his robotics talk. Richard's interested not just in robots but in the way in which robots and humans interact. So it's a similar thing. It's about it's that space between humans and the data sphere or robots. So the second is to explore how creative sonification of live data as an agent in music performance can allow audiences to experience the dynamics and qualities of large-scale systems such as weather or climate as an affective experience. So that led to, there's a few, I guess, an idea to do a work, which is the work I'm going to talk about, which is called Solar Halo. And that work, the development of that work was supported by 3 organisations, one in Australia and 2 in the US. It started off as a artist residency in the Victorian High Country in the Bogong High Plains area near Falls Creek, supported by an organisation called the Bogong Centre for Sound Culture. And that permitted me time to kind of, in that Victorian High Country, to kind of get to understand not just the landscapes and whatever, but also the weather systems of that high country. And the US Partners Experimental Intermedia Foundation was the presenting organisation for the series where I premiered it, and Harvestworks Digital Media Centre was the venue. So they were the project supporters. I would like to acknowledge the support and help of those 3 organisations. So essentially the work Solar Halo is a work, well, it's on the tin in the title, isn't it? For 16 weather stations and live performer. This work draws upon live data from 8 weather stations in the Victorian Alpine country around the Bogong High Plains area and 8 weather stations in New York City. And so the performance was in New York City in December last year, which is kind of midwinter, East Coast US. And so the data from the performance was in Manhattan. So from 8 weather stations in the Manhattan kind of and surrounds area, and 8 weather stations across the Victorian Alpine country where it was kind of midsummer in December. So it's kind of like a dialogue between the weather systems of these 2 places. If you, in kind of, plain terms, I mean, a lot of weather data is captured. It's captured at different speeds by weather stations. Some of it is captured almost momentarily, like wind speed and direction. Temperatures fairly quick. Other things are much slower. So, the data comes in at different speeds. Different weather stations have different speeds of updating and so on. But essentially, you can wind up with more or less continuous data streams for functional purposes that you can be getting current conditions from. So essentially, the weather station is pumping out data. Most of that data is connected to the internet. So almost all atmospheric weather stations beyond any level have a capacity to connect themselves to the internet. And there are a number of global networks for the sharing of weather data. I used one called Visual Crossing, but there are a bunch of other networks. Interestingly, in the time of making these works, I've had to hop networks a few times because data is valuable, and people, where they used to give you free access, lock you off and make you want to pay a lot of money to get this data now. So the first system I was using, I had to jump from because they wanted large amounts of money. However, I did get around that because if you buy a weather station and you become a contributor to the network, you can get data down from. So in my house in Sydney, I have a weather station in the backyard, which people think is pretty weird, but it gets me free data. So it's good. So basically, the concept of the work is that if you think about the sort of creative act or the compositional act, in this case, it is partly about making software. So it's kind of coding or making software as a creative practice of its own, because in a way you're building the engine or designing the system through which things happen, right? I think for those of us that work with technology, this is a familiar concept. it's quite interesting when we talk about the artifacts of research and non-traditional research outputs that, software can be an output, although a lot of people outside of this area don't really see that. I kind of see it like an instrument, right? So it's like building an instrument, basically, is the process. It's a long and laborious process that sends you a little bit mad, takes a long time, but when it's finished, it's a beautiful thing, and it can be used for different purposes. So essentially, there are two elements to it. There is an audio element and there is a visual element, and the data from the weather stations is driving both the audio and the visual elements of the work. So in that sense, it's both aspects of it are dynamic and weather responsive, and then the live performer jumps into that kind of like an environment. For the video element, I'm kind of using these mesh or wireframe kind of structures, which are kind of modulated by all of the weather parameters. So it's kind of has that kind of aesthetic, although the sort of baseline movement of these wire and mesh structures is from water surfaces, and then the way in which the wireframe gets deformed and the parameters around are driven by all of the weather elements on top. So it's kind of a highly, it's a sort of a technical, wireframe. It's kind of a reductive view of something, but because it has water and weather as the sort of agents on it, it's very fluid. So it's quite an interesting combination of sort of high tech, but also quite languid and fluid in terms of its movement. So yeah, but basically in that environment, in the environments that I use to program in, I can work across, this is back to the interdisciplinary thing, I can work across the audio, music, video domains with, they're kind of porous to each other in terms of the way that data comes in and out of them and affects them. Okay, so in technical terms, those of you who are nerds, I know there's always nerds in here. This is the kind of process workflow. We have weather stations out there. They're connected to the internet. I make API calls, application programming interface calls to them to pull the data down, and then that comes into custom software, and then all those individual bits of data are passed out from a big bundle into their constituent elements, and then each of those elements is then fed to whatever I want to feed that to. Solar radiation could make a sound brighter or darker or something like that. You can be as literal as that, or you could be more abstract. That's part of the creative process. And then off the other side of it, as I say, the live performer is in there, not quite sure what the weather is going to do on the day. Each performance will have a slightly different outcome depending on the weather conditions at each location and the stations. So you don't quite know what you're going to get once you get in there. So yeah, so it's all passed out to all of the different elements, and then basically I feed it into a piece of software. I mean, this is the top level of it, and I will give you a bit of a look through it. But I've sort of built the top level of it because it's what I see on one screen when I'm performing. It just helps me locate what's going on. So, it's a series of, I can see all the data control messages flowing in and out of things. I can see if there's a problem. Also, I can interact with it in various ways by, using controllers or other things that I have there for live performance. So yeah, so this is, as I say, this is an artifact of the creative process. Those of you that do this work, I don't know, there's a number in the room, will know that, this is kind of a bit like it's like learning any sort of creative process or any kind of art form. You have to, you have to teach yourself how to do this stuff, and, you get better as you get each work you make, and, it's that interesting kind of nexus that you sit between artist or programmer, and how far do you go down rabbit holes. And it's an interesting, because you can spend a lot of time down those rabbit holes, right? And not make any work. So yeah, so that's kind of part of the process. I will give you a bit of a look through the way that the system works, but yeah, it's got all kind of different blocks or components that all do kind of different things from it. I'm going to so in the actual performance, I don't have very good stills from this, but essentially, yeah, it's live performer with video. So this is a couple of stills from the performance at the end of last year. some of the challenges of doing this kind of thing is it got me thinking about the problem of hyper objects in a way. It's not just how vast the hyper object is in terms of, its sort of apparent scale. It's also the temporal aspects of, things like climate change is slow, although it's kind of quick in one sense, because in our lifetimes it's got quite a bit warmer, but people don't notice it happening. It's slow enough for people not to really kind of appreciate that it's going on, and that's sort of one of the challenges, is this sort of temporal part of it. And in terms of the creative process, that's also challenging in a way, because some parts of weather are quick, depending on the day, like wind, that kind of stuff, and then stuff like temperature is slow. Barometric pressure is also really slow. So there are different kind of temporal structures that sit within a climate system or a weather system that you sort of have to try and figure out how to deal with those different speeds happening at the same time, and make them kind of useful in a creative work. I mean, there's a lot of people that have done sort of temporal works, like, using the data of glaciers melting or something for, 20 years, and created an audio work or something, or a visual work of 20 years of melting, which, it's just cool. It's kind of good in a way that helps you comprehend that sort of slow thing in a way, that temporal, by speeding it up. But in this work, I was committed to liveness as an idea, and also just as a sort of from a performance point of view, not quite knowing what you were going to encounter at the time, because it was, you kind of giving yourself over to the weather system at the time and the prevailing weather conditions at the time of the performance. So we might just spend like 10 minutes just having a bit of a look through how the software works, and then I know a number of people in the room do a bit of this kind of work, so maybe people might want to have a bit of a chat about it.
At this point, a video was played that will not translate well into the podcast format. The presentation resumed as follows.
But that's sort of an overview, I guess, of the whole system. What I'm trying to do, as I say, is kind of get this sense of connecting us affectively to something like a weather system. It's a bit hard with a small excerpt like that, but the original performance is like, I think, 55 minutes. So it's quite sort of immersive, and you're going through all of the 16 locations. And each location, the way I kind of did it, is kind of like a different micro environment. And then it's kind of, you arrive, it's like you're landing your spacecraft, wherever it is, at JFK, on Wall Street. And then that's an environment, and then stuff happens. So it's kind of like episodic in that way, in that each weather station has a world that's associated with it. And then, the weather drives that world on the day. So that's probably a reasonable overview.
Thanks so much. Let's put our hands together to thank Julian. It's a brilliant seminar, which we really enjoyed, I think, and it's wonderful to have in the Dean role such an expert in practice-led research and a musician to boot. And I want to have a live feed on faculty budget saving data. Which will be a very happy song. Look forward to that. Thank you very much, everybody.